The cabin of Flight 884 to Halverson City was calm, the usual pre-flight hum filling the air as travelers shuffled into their seats. Amid the quiet rustle of seatbelts and overhead bins, a subtle tension began to rise. Flight attendant Ava Morgan moved smoothly through the aisle, her sharp eyes catching every detail, a habit formed over years in the air. But today, something tugged at her attention. In seat 2C of first class sat a man who was too still, too composed, while passengers chatted, adjusted bags, or flipped through magazines. The man in 2C sat with a leather briefcase tucked neatly beneath his seat, flipping through a worn novel. He wore a plain navy jacket and dark trousers, not flashy, not out of place, but somehow unsettling. Ava's gaze lingered on him longer than it should have. Maybe it was how he contrasted with the polished business travelers usually found in first class. Maybe it was his silence in a space filled with movement. She didn't know exactly why, but a quiet unease began to bloom in her chest. She noticed his boarding pass on the tray table in front of him. He was, by all accounts, in the right place. Still, her instincts whispered otherwise. Ava approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice steady but quietly probing. "May I ask to see your boarding pass and ID one more time?" The man looked up, calm and unbothered. There was no irritation in his expression, only a mild surprise. Without a word, he handed over the documents. His name, Jonas Reed. Nothing about him jumped out. No red flags, no errors. Still, Ava found herself studying the ID longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said as she returned it, forcing herself to move on. As she walked back toward the galley, she passed her fellow crew member, Camilla, who was arranging drinks behind the cart. Ava leaned in and whispered low, "Did you get a look at the guy in 2C? Something feels off." Camilla followed her gaze briefly and shrugged. "He seems normal to me. Has a ticket, doesn't he?" "He does," Ava said, hesitating, "but I don't know. I just have a bad feeling." Camilla gave her a skeptical look, but didn't argue. Ava returned to her tasks, checking overhead bins and seat rows, but her attention kept slipping back to Jonas. He wasn't doing anything wrong, not really. Just reading, glancing at his watch, sitting there with an odd, unwavering calm. But Ava's gut churned. She'd heard too many stories, situations where people ignored a feeling and regretted it later. She couldn't let that happen on her watch. As the cabin door closed and the engines began to hum, she made a choice. Quietly, she picked up the intercom phone near the galley and called the ground crew. Her voice was measured, but there was tension just beneath the surface. "This is Flight 884, she said. "We have a passenger in first class, seat 2C. Something feels off. Can someone verify his credentials before we depart?" She hung up and tried to convince herself it was just protocol. A routine check. But deep down, she knew something about Jonas wasn't ordinary. The plane remained parked on the tarmac. Conversations buzzed softly around the cabin. Overhead bins clinked shut. Ava tried to stay busy, checking belts and securing the galley, but her eyes kept drifting back to seat 2C. Jonas still sat quietly, book in lap, appearing oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding around him. Then the intercom buzzed. "Ground control here. Security team dispatched. Hold position until further notice." Ava's chest tightened. Relief? Dread? She wasn't sure which. Camilla glanced at her, her expression a mix of curiosity and mild irritation. She leaned closer and whispered, "Are you absolutely sure about this? You know people are going to be upset if it's nothing. Ava folded her arms and stared out the window. "I just want to make sure we're safe," she said. "That's all." "You could be blowing this way out of proportion," Camilla whispered, careful not to let any nearby passengers overhear. Ava crossed her arms tightly, her voice firm but low. "It's not about him. It's about the safety of everyone on this flight." Camilla shook her head, exhaling through her nose, but didn't push the issue. The atmosphere in the cabin was beginning to shift. The longer the delay dragged on, the more passengers started noticing something was off. Quiet conversations rippled through the rows like nervous electricity, and more than a few curious glances drifted toward the front. Then the tension thickened as 2 security officers boarded the plane. Their crisp uniforms and no-nonsense demeanor silenced the remaining chatter. They moved down the aisle with intent, scanning each row until their eyes locked on Jonas Reed in Seat 2C. The taller of the two stepped forward. "Sir," he said in a firm but controlled voice, "may we speak with you for a moment?" Jonas looked up slowly, his expression unreadable, but offered no resistance. He calmly closed his book, placed it on the tray table with deliberate care, and stood. A young woman across the aisle leaned toward her seatmate and whispered, "What's going on? He doesn't even look like he did anything wrong." Ava stood frozen near the galley, her hands gripping the metal counter. She watched every move, her heart pounding as Jonas gathered his briefcase and followed the officers without a word. As the trio exited into the jet bridge, whispers erupted across the cabin like a fuse being lit. "Did you see how calm he was?" someone murmured. "Maybe that's the scary part," another replied. "People like that don't show it on the outside." Camilla turned to Ava, her tone sharp now, laced with frustration. "This better amount to something," she said, it under her breath. "If not, we've just held up a flight full of people, and you'll be writing reports for days." Ava didn't respond. She was still staring out the small oval window, watching as Jonas disappeared from view. She told herself it had been the right call. It had to be. But a gnawing doubt crept in. What if she'd been wrong? What if he was just a man on a flight? Outside the aircraft, Jonas was escorted into a sterile room off the jet bridge. A small windowless space filled with the buzz of fluorescent lights and the sterile scent of cleaning solution. One officer gestured toward the metal chair at the table. Jonas complied, placing his briefcase beside him and folding his hands neatly in front of him. The taller officer took the lead, his voice clipped but polite. "Mr. Reed, we received a report regarding potentially suspicious behavior. Before we proceed, we need to verify your identification and ask a few questions." Jonas raised a single brow, not in defiance, but curiosity. "Of course," he said evenly, "though I'd be interested to know what exactly was considered suspicious." The officer hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with his partner. "It's standard procedure, sir. When a concern is raised, we're obligated to follow through." Jonas nodded slowly. "Understood." He opened his briefcase with calm, practiced hands and withdrew a sleek black wallet. From it, he produced a government-issued ID, a business card embossed with a silver crest, and a letter bearing an official seal. He laid them out across the table and leaned back, observing as the officers examined each item. The shorter officer's brows lifted slightly as he read the business card. He leaned toward his partner, muttering something under his breath. Recognition flickered in the taller one's eyes. His posture shifted subtly. "Mr. Reed," he said again. This time, the tone softened, more respectful. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding. Everything checks out. We apologize for the inconvenience." Jonas gave no outward sign of frustration, but a faint weariness crept into his eyes. "I'm sure you're simply doing your duty," he replied calmly. "Though I would appreciate knowing what initiated this situation in the first place." Again, the two men exchanged a glance. This time, the shorter one spoke. "We received a call from the flight crew. We can't share more than that. But it's standard to act on any report, regardless of the nature." Jonas leaned back, arms folding gently across his chest. Though his tone remained even, his gaze sharpened. "I see. Then I hope, in the future, the weight of such decisions is considered more carefully. Assumptions like these, they don't just waste time, they carry consequences." The officers visibly shifted in their seats, now uncomfortable under his steady gaze. "Of course," the taller one said softly. "Would you like to reboard the plane, or would you prefer another arrangement?" Jonas glanced at his watch, then back at the officers. "I'll return to my seat," he said. "I have a schedule to maintain." He stood, collecting his briefcase, but paused at the doorway. "One last thing," he added, turning back to face them. "When you explain this to the flight staff, be sure they understand. We should judge actions, not appearances." With quiet resolve, Jonas Reed walked out of the security room, his footsteps steady and deliberate, leaving behind two officers who now wore expressions far different from when they'd entered. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shown anger, but somehow he'd left them with more questions than answers, and a silence that said far more than words ever could. Back inside Flight 884, the air remained thick with curiosity and suspicion. The passengers had all returned to their seats, but their gazes kept drifting toward the front of the cabin. Every whispered word and exchanged glance held the same unspoken question. Was he guilty, or had they just made a mistake? Near the galley, Ava Morgan stood rigid, her nerves fraying like worn thread. She kept her eyes fixed on the sealed door of the jet bridge, willing it to open, or maybe hoping it wouldn't. Her colleague, Camilla Diaz, leaned against the beverage counter, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her frustration now impossible to hide. "What's going on out there?" Camilla asked sharply under her breath. "This delay is starting to cause real problems. We've got passengers who are connecting a tight schedule, and if nothing comes of this..." Ava didn't respond. Her attention remained locked on that door. The tension in her chest only grew heavier. She wanted reassurance that she'd made the right call, that the strange feeling in her gut had meant something. But what if it hadn't? What if Jonas had just been a man with good posture, a calm face, and a book? Voices murmured behind her. Passengers speculating, filling the silence with assumptions. An older woman 2 rows back leaned toward her seatmate. "I still can't believe they took him off," she said. "He looked so polite." "Sometimes that's the point," the seatmate replied. "It's always the quiet ones you have to watch." The jet bridge door creaked open, and there he was. Jonas stepped calmly back onto the aircraft, his leather briefcase in hand, his expression unchanged from when he'd left. He moved with the same composure that had drawn Ava's attention in the first place, like he was exactly where he was meant to be, unaffected by the disruption he'd just endured. The cabin fell into an almost reverent silence as every head turned to follow his return. Jonas didn't acknowledge them, didn't scan the room. His eyes stayed forward as he moved down the aisle with a quiet assurance. Ava's breath hitched as he passed. He didn't look at her. Not at first. He simply returned to seat 2C, placed his briefcase back under the seat, and sat, as if nothing had happened. The other passengers exchanged glances, some whispering, others frowning. No announcement, no explanation, just back to normal. Except nothing felt normal to Ava. Then, as if he felt her gaze burning into him, Jonas turned his head ever so slightly. Their eyes met. There was no anger there, no accusation, just an unnerving calm that made Ava's stomach twist. It was like he could see through her professionalism, her confidence, her training, and into the knot of doubt she'd been wrestling with since the moment she first noticed him. The look lasted only a second, but it rattled her. She quickly turned away, pretending to adjust a tray of unused plastic cups, her hands trembling more than she liked. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Apologies for the delay. We've been cleared for departure and expect a smooth flight. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Camilla brushed past Ava to begin pre-takeoff checks, but not before throwing her appointed look. As the plane began to taxi, Ava moved stiffly through the motions, but her mind was somewhere else. She kept glancing at Jonas. Each time, he looked just as composed, now leaning back, eyes closed, as if the earlier disruption hadn't even brushed against his peace. Meanwhile, Ava felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. She had trusted her instinct. It had screamed at her that something was off. And yet here he was, back in his seat, undisturbed, cleared by security, with a boarding pass and ID as legitimate as anyone else's. As the plane lifted into the sky, slicing through the clouds and into its cruising altitude, the passengers settled into a hush. Books opened, headphones slipped on, drinks were ordered in soft voices. The engines hummed steadily, and for the first time since boarding, the cabin felt still, but not for Ava. She hovered near the galley, sneaking glances at Jonas. Her unease hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. She couldn't stop replaying everything in her mind. His demeanor, his eyes, his calmness, his note-taking. From her vantage point, she saw him unzip his briefcase and pull out a sleek black notebook and pen. He flipped it open, scanned a page, and began to write. Slowly, thoughtfully. Her stomach tightened again. It was such a normal action, innocuous, mundane. But in the context of everything else, it sent her mind spiraling. What was he writing? Was it about the flight? About her? Was he observing them the way she'd observed him? She didn't realize she was staring until Camilla nudged her with her elbow. "You have got to stop obsessing over this," Camilla whispered, annoyed. "You saw the security team walk him back on. He's not doing anything. You're letting this get to your head." Ava shook her head, her voice low but urgent. "You don't get it. There's something about him. I can't explain it. It's just—" "What? That he's quiet? Or that he doesn't look like your idea of someone in first class?" Camilla's voice held more bite than before. "Because that's what it seems like, Ava." The words stung. Ava's lips parted, ready to argue. But she stopped. Was that what this was? A judgment based on appearance, on demeanor, on the fact that he didn't behave like the loud, distracted travelers she was used to? "No," she muttered. "It's not that." But even as she said it, a small part of her began to wonder. Before the thought could settle, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Folks, we're expecting calm skies for the remainder of the flight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." A simple message, but for Ava, relaxing was impossible. She cast one last glance down the aisle. Jonas had set his notebook aside again, resting against the seat back with his hands folded across his lap. Eyes closed, calm as ever. And still, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this flight and this man were going to haunt her far beyond the moment they touched back down. The captain's calm voice faded from the intercom, bringing a slight shift in the cabin's atmosphere. A few passengers leaned back in their seats. The tension seemed to loosen. For them, but not for Ava Morgan. She moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, checking on passengers, refilling water cups, and adjusting trays. Outwardly, she wore her professional smile. Inside, her nerves remained taut. Then just a few rows behind Jonas Reed, she noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach into the overhead compartment. Her hands trembled as she tried to retrieve a small bag tucked tightly between others. Before Ava could step in, Jonas had already risen. Without hesitation, he reached up, freed the bag, and handed it to the woman with a kind smile and a few quiet words Ava couldn't make out. The woman's face lit up with gratitude. "You're such a gentleman," she said loudly enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. "Thank you so much." It was a simple moment, ordinary even, but it didn't go unnoticed. Several passengers glanced at one another, their earlier wariness now tempered with curiosity. The man who had been pulled off the plane under suspicion was now helping an elderly traveler like it was second nature. Ava stood frozen, just for a second, watching Jonas return to his seat. Calm, composed, unbothered. Like he hadn't just caused the entire flight to be delayed, like he hadn't just stared into her soul hours earlier. She wanted to feel relieved, wanted this to be the part where she told herself she had overreacted, that he was just a thoughtful, soft-spoken man on a business trip. But that knot in her stomach only tightened. His calmness wasn't casual. It was too measured, too exact. As though every smile, every nod, every step had been carefully rehearsed. Ava couldn't explain why, but she felt it. There was still something more to Jonas than he was letting on. The flight moved on as though nothing had happened. Beverages were served. Tray tables came down. Soft conversation filled the cabin again. But Ava's attention kept drifting back to Jonas. Every motion he made was deliberate, every gesture quiet, but confident. He interacted with almost no one, unless they spoke to him first. And when he did speak, it was always with a composed, almost philosophical air. He wasn't trying to blend in. He simply seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere all at once. Ava made her way toward the front of the cabin again, stopping to check on the first-class rows. That's when she noticed a little boy, no more than 6 or 7, peeking over the seat in front of Jonas. The boy held a small action figure in one hand and was waving it in Jonas's direction, his eyes wide with curiosity. Jonas turned his head slightly and noticed the gesture. A gentle smile curved his lips. He leaned forward a bit, engaging without speaking. "Do you like superheroes?" the boy asked, his voice bubbling with excitement. Jonas tilted his head thoughtfully, as though the question truly required deep consideration. "I think superheroes are fascinating," he said, his tone warm and clear. "They remind us that anyone, no matter who they are, can choose to do good." The boy grinned, bouncing in his seat. He launched into a rapid description of his favorite hero, voice rising above the gentle hum of the cabin. His parents, clearly embarrassed, tried to hush him. But Jonas raised a hand, smiling at them. "It's fine," he said, handing the action figure back to the boy. A little excitement never hurt anyone. Ava watched from a few rows away, her feelings spiraling, His words were kind, his demeanor patient. His tone carried a calm wisdom that made her stomach turn, not with fear, but with something harder to name, unease wrapped in awe. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong, it was that he was doing everything so perfectly. Just then, a soft chime rang overhead, a signal from the cockpit. The captain wanted to speak with her. That wasn't normal. Ava passed her tray to Camilla, who raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She made her way to the cockpit, her pulse picking up speed. Inside, the captain glanced at her briefly before folding his hands on his lap. "I got a follow-up from the ground crew," he began, his voice neutral. "That passenger in 2C, Mr. Reed, he was cleared. But they also mentioned something unusual." Ava's throat tightened. Unusual. The captain leaned back. "They didn't go into detail, just said he's someone significant, someone with influence. Whatever triggered the report, it was handled at a higher level than normal." "Someone important?" Ava echoed. He nodded. "We're not being given the full picture. But the people who cleared him, they don't clear just anyone." Ava's mind raced. If Jonas was someone important, then why didn't he say so? Why allow himself to be pulled off the plane without explanation? Why return quietly, notebook in hand, as though nothing had ever happened? "Just keep things calm," the captain said. "Let's get to Halverson on time and avoid any more turbulence." In the air or in the cabin? Ava nodded stiffly, leaving the cockpit with more questions than answers. She moved back toward the galley in a daze. As she passed through first class, she glanced once more at Jonas. He was seated upright again, notebook open, pen gliding across the page in steady strokes. His attention didn't drift. Whatever he was writing, he was completely focused. She tried not to stare, but it was impossible. What was he writing about? What kind of man, pulled off a plane, questioned, and reboarded under mystery? Simply returned to journaling? Back near the galley, she leaned against the counter, trying to settle the storm in her mind. But her thoughts spun endlessly. Why was he on this flight? Why here? Why now? And why did it feel like he was the one observing her? The captain's words echoed relentlessly in Ava Morgan's mind. Someone important. It explained why the security officers had backed off so quickly. Why Jonas Reed had been allowed back onto the plane with barely a glance, despite the suspicion that had loomed around him like a shadow. But it didn't explain everything else. Why he had stayed so calm, why he had said nothing in his defense, why he had let the entire ordeal unfold like he'd been expecting it. Most people, especially powerful ones, made their presence known when their authority was questioned. Not Jonas. He had sat back and let the moment pass, as if observing from a distance, as though all of it had been part of something larger. The plane cruised steadily above the clouds now. Passengers had slipped into the rhythm of mid-flight, some watching movies, others flipping through magazines, while a few had already begun to doze off beneath fleece blankets. Jonas, meanwhile, remained immersed in his notebook. From where Ava stood near the galley, she could just barely see the slow, deliberate movement of his pen across the page. There was purpose in every stroke, intention in every pause. It didn't look like casual doodling or idle journaling. He was recording something, maybe everything. Her curiosity, already fraying at the edges, finally began to unravel. She turned toward Camilla, who was restocking sugar packets in a drawer. "Camilla," Ava whispered, her voice tight. "I need to know more about him." Camilla looked up, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fatigue. "You're kidding, right?" "I'm serious," Ava replied. Something doesn't sit right. Camilla let out a long breath and leaned back against the counter. He's not doing anything wrong. You saw that. The guy's just calm. Maybe he's introverted, or maybe he just likes notebooks. That doesn't make him suspicious. Ava shook her head. It's not that simple. The captain told me the ground crew implied he's someone important, but no one said why, no title, no explanation. If he's that important, why didn't he just say something when I asked for his ID? Camilla narrowed her eyes. So what? You want to interrogate him again? Come on, Ava. Just ask him directly if you're that curious. You're making this into a conspiracy, and we've still got half the flight to go. Ava looked toward seat 2C. Jonas was still writing, as focused and composed as ever. She hesitated. Approaching him felt like stepping onto a stage she didn't understand, speaking a language she wasn't fluent in. But the gnawing inside her wouldn't let go. This was her chance. If she didn't take it now, she'd regret it. She walked slowly down the aisle. Jonas seemed to sense her before she arrived. He glanced up, meeting her eyes with the same steady calm that had thrown her off balance from the beginning. Mr. Reed, she said softly, careful not to draw attention from nearby passengers. I just wanted to check if you needed anything, a drink, a snack. He closed his notebook and rested it gently on his tray table. Thank you, he said, his voice smooth and polite. But I'm all right. She hesitated, then decided to go further. I couldn't help but notice you've been writing a lot, she said, choosing her words carefully. If you don't mind me asking, are you working on something important? His lips curled slightly into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. You could say that, he replied. I like to capture my thoughts, especially during moments that are revealing. Her breath caught. Revealing? Jonas nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. Every situation has layers, don't you think? What appears straightforward is often anything but. There's always something deeper, just beneath the surface. Ava felt her chest tighten. His words felt too precise, too relevant. It was as if he were talking about her, not just in generalities. That's an interesting perspective, she said, trying to steady her voice. Jonas leaned back in his seat, still watching her. The trick, he said quietly, is knowing when to peel back the layers and when to leave them untouched. Ava opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She stood there, frozen in place, feeling exposed, somehow. Without saying much at all, Jonas had acknowledged her doubt, her fear, even her guilt. And yet, he hadn't judged her. Finally, she offered a weak smile. Well, if you need anything, just let me know. Of course, he replied, lifting his notebook again. Thank you. As she walked back toward the galley, she felt his eyes follow her for a moment, before returning to his page. The moment was over, but the impact of it wasn't. Ava slumped into her jump seat, heart pounding, his composure, his cryptic phrases. They didn't feel like evasion. They felt like something much more calculated, something purposeful. What did he mean by layers? Was he talking about her reaction to him, or something else entirely? She played the conversation over and over again in her head. His tone had been calm, almost soothing, but laced with subtext she couldn't quite unpack. When to peel back the layers, when to let them be. Was he warning her, or guiding her? She looked down the aisle again. Jonas was writing with renewed focus now, his posture slightly different. More engaged. Occasionally he'd pause, glance out the window, then resume writing. He wasn't just reflecting, he was documenting, cataloging. The idea sent a chill down her spine. Was he writing about her? About the passengers? Was this his job, his purpose? She didn't know. But the need to find out only grew stronger. Camilla sat down beside her, with a heavy sigh and a coffee stirrer between her teeth. "You're still obsessing," she said, not even bothering to phrase it as a question. Ava didn't deny it. She didn't have to. "You're still stuck on him, aren't you?" Camilla Diaz muttered, her voice a careful blend of exasperation and concern. Ava Morgan let out a quiet sigh and ran a hand through her hair, eyes still drawn toward Jonas Reed, like a compass refusing to point elsewhere. "I can't explain it. He's too calm, too precise. And the way he speaks, it's like he already knows something the rest of us don't." Camilla cracked a wry smile in an attempt to break the tension. "Maybe he's writing about us, you know. The flight attendant who couldn't stop watching me. I'd read that." Ava shot her a sharp look, but said nothing. "I'm serious," she said finally, lowering her voice. "What if he's not just some eccentric traveler? What if I missed something when I reported him? Something bigger?" Camilla's teasing demeanor faded. Her shoulders softened. "Ava," she said gently, "you followed protocol. You trusted your instinct. Security cleared him, didn't they? If there were a real issue, he wouldn't be sitting in 2C right now, sipping water and scribbling in a notebook. You've got to let it go." Ava nodded, but the motion felt hollow. Her mind was anything but still. She decided to take Camilla's advice, or at least pretend to. She stepped out of the galley and returned to the cabin, forcing herself to refocus on the needs of the other passengers. She smiled when necessary, collected empty cups, and offered assistance where it was needed, her body going through the motions like a well-trained machine. But her mind stayed locked on one thing: Jonas. As she passed his row again, she noticed something that made her pause. He wasn't writing anymore. His notebook, which had rarely left his hands during the flight, now lay closed on his lap. His pen rested across the top, untouched. Jonas was staring out the window, completely still, his thoughts seemingly lost somewhere far beyond the clouds. Ava hesitated. Should she keep walking? Before she could make a decision, Jonas turned, and for the first time, he spoke her name. Ava. He said it softly, not like someone recalling it from her name tag, but like someone who had known it all along. She swallowed hard. "Yes," she replied, her voice quieter than intended. He studied her for a moment, his gaze calm, unreadable. Then finally he said, "You seem troubled. Is everything all right?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to brush it off with a tight-lipped smile and a nod. But his tone? It disarmed her. "I'm fine," she said, though she didn't sound convinced even to herself. Jonas nodded once, slowly. "Good," he said, leaning back again, "because sometimes, when we go looking for answers, we miss the most important questions." The words hit her like a wave. Before she could respond, he picked up the notebook again and opened it to a fresh page. He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. The message had already been delivered. Ava stood frozen for a beat longer than she should have, then turned and walked away. Back in the galley, she sat down heavily, her heart pounding harder than during takeoff. That one exchange had shaken her more than any earlier interaction. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he'd said them. Measured, precise, inevitable. It felt like he had pulled something from inside her that she didn't even know was there. The hum of the engines filled the space around her, but Ava barely registered it. Her thoughts looped relentlessly. Is he trying to tell me something? Warn me? Or just reflect something back at me I didn't want to see? She looked toward his seat again. He was writing once more, though with a different energy now. His movements were more purposeful, his eyes sharper. Occasionally he would glance out the window, then return to the page, as if documenting the world from a vantage only he understood. That thought unsettled her in a new way. Was he cataloging something, observing them all, watching her? Before she could spiral further, Camilla returned with a stack of empty trays and a crooked smile. "Rough one?" she asked. Ava nodded weakly. "Passengers can be the worst," Camilla added with a chuckle. Ava forced a smile, but said nothing. Her gaze wandered again to Jonas, and that's when she noticed it. He had closed the notebook, carefully, deliberately. Then he placed it inside his briefcase, latched it shut, and leaned back in his seat. He closed his eyes, and for some reason, that moment, more than any conversation or gesture, sent a fresh chill down Ava's spine. It was like he'd decided his work was done, like whatever he had come to observe was complete. A soft ding echoed through the cabin as the seatbelt sign illuminated. The captain's voice followed, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Halverson City. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure your trays are secured." Ava stood there, hands gripping the galley's edge, her pulse quickening. The moment for answers was running out. And somehow, she felt certain, Jonas Reed had already learned what he came to learn. The question was, what had she missed? "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Halverson City. Please fasten your seatbelts and return your seatbacks to the upright position." The captain's voice echoed calmly through the cabin. Ava Morgan moved from the galley into the aisle, her polished exterior snapping into place as if on cue. She checked seatbelts, adjusted tray tables, and gently reminded passengers of the safety instructions. Her routine was flawless, but inside, she was anything but composed. As she approached Jonas Reed's row, she noticed a shift in his demeanor. He wasn't tense, not by any stretch, but there was a quiet alertness about him now. His body language had changed, subtle but unmistakable. He was no longer just waiting, he was ready. Their eyes met briefly. He offered her a small nod, barely perceptible, but it sent a chill sliding down her spine. She returned the gesture, forcing her feet to keep moving down the aisle. But her heart had already begun to race. By the time the plane entered its final approach, Ava was sure of one thing. This wasn't over. In fact, it felt like something was only just beginning. The cabin stirred to life as passengers began organizing their things, stretching, whispering about connections, and preparing for arrival. Ava moved among them with quiet professionalism, her smile automatic, her presence calm. But her mind swirled in chaos. Each time she glanced toward Jonas, the same unsettling thought surfaced. There's more to him than meets the eye. Jonas sat upright now, hands resting neatly on his lap, gaze forward, not anxious, not distracted, focused, as if anticipating something only he understood. Ava's instincts screamed louder than ever. The wheels touched down with a soft screech, sparking a wave of relieved applause. The tension of the flight seemed to dissolve for most of the passengers, except for Ava. The captain came back on the intercom, thanking everyone for flying, and reminding them to remain seated until the aircraft came to a full stop at the gate. Ava moved swiftly to the galley to prepare for disembarkation, her hands working without thought. Every motion felt automatic. Her mind was trapped in a loop, circling back to Jonas again and again. She couldn't shake it. She couldn't let it go. By the time the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers were already rising, stretching, pulling bags from overhead bins. Ava stood near the exit, offering pleasant farewells, her voice steady, despite the pounding in her chest. One by one, the travelers filed out, all except Jonas. He remained seated, waiting patiently as the last of the passengers cleared the aisle. When he finally rose, it was with the same unhurried composure that had defined him since the moment he boarded. He reached for his briefcase and adjusted the strap on his shoulder. Ava stepped forward. She didn't have a plan, didn't have a speech. But she knew she couldn't let him walk away without saying something, without trying. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, her voice tight but steady. He turned to her, expression calm but attentive. "Yes." Ava hesitated. Then she stepped just a little closer, lowering her voice so no lingering passengers would overhear. "I know it's not my place, but I can't help feeling like there's more to you than you're letting on. Who are you, really?" Jonas held her gaze. For a moment he said nothing. Then a small, knowing smile curved his lips. Not mocking, not smug. Just understanding. "I appreciate your curiosity," he said quietly, his tone firm but gentle. "But sometimes the answers we seek aren't nearly as important as the questions we learn to ask." Ava frowned, caught off guard by the response. It felt like a riddle, a truth buried inside a puzzle. Jonas adjusted his briefcase, glanced toward the open jet bridge, then looked at her one last time. "Take care, Miss Morgan," he said. "You're more perceptive than most." With that, he turned and walked down the aisle, steps steady, unhurried. Ava stood there, watching him disappear through the door and into the terminal beyond. Her chest ached with a strange mix of frustration and awe. She didn't know whether she felt enlightened or defeated. His words lingered in the space he left behind, haunting and unfinished. The questions we learn to ask. She remained rooted near the galley as the last passengers trickled off the plane, many offering casual thank yous. Ava barely heard them. Her focus stayed fixed on the doorway through which Jonas had vanished. Her thoughts spun like an engine refusing to shut down. What had he meant? Was he hinting at something deeper? Or was he just toying with her curiosity? The more she tried to make sense of it, the more it twisted in her mind. His calmness, his timing, his cryptic remarks. All of it sat just beyond her understanding, like a dream that slipped away the moment she reached for it. And still, something inside her knew. Jonas wasn't just another passenger. He had been someone significant, someone who saw more than he let on, someone who had come and gone, leaving behind more questions than answers. Ava exhaled and leaned against the galley wall, the tension finally catching up to her. Her legs ached, her mind raced, but even through the exhaustion one thought remained. She might never know who he truly was. But she would never forget him. Camilla Diaz's voice cut through the fog in Ava Morgan's mind like a wire snapping taut. "Earth to Ava," she said, waving a hand gently in front of her. "You've been staring at that door like you're expecting him to walk right back through it." Ava blinked and turned toward her friend, trying to mask the storm inside her. "It's nothing," she replied, her voice quiet and uncertain. "I was just thinking." Camilla tilted her head, unconvinced. "Look, I know this flight's been weird. Beyond weird, actually. But you've got to let it go. He's gone. Whatever that was between you and Mr. Mystery, it's over." But it didn't feel over. Not to Ava. Jonas's presence still lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. His unshakable calm, the cryptic way he spoke, the way he seemed to carry answers no one else even knew to ask. None of it felt resolved. It all felt like a story that had stopped mid-chapter. The rest of the crew moved into their post-flight routine, preparing the cabin for the next leg. Ava joined them, folding blankets, straightening seats, her hands working while her thoughts raced. When she reached 2C, her heart skipped. There, sticking just barely out of the seatback pocket, was a piece of folded paper. Her pulse quickened. It could have been anything: a boarding pass, a receipt, a gum wrapper. But something inside her knew. She scanned the cabin to make sure no one was watching, then slipped the paper out carefully. It wasn't a receipt. It was a note. Written on thick, cream-colored stationery, the kind you'd never find lying around a commercial airliner. The handwriting was precise, elegant, the kind of penmanship that came from someone who paid attention to detail, someone who thought before they wrote. Ava unfolded it with trembling fingers. Perception is often shaped by what we are afraid to see. Look closer, and you may find the truth hidden in plain sight. The words hit her like a wave of cold air. She knew, without a shadow of doubt, the note was from Jonas. She quickly folded it and slipped it into her pocket, her heart hammering in her chest. Her fingers lingered on the paper. Its weight felt far heavier than it should have, as if it carried the burden of all her unanswered questions. Was this meant for her? Was it a message, a warning, or something else entirely? She thought back through every moment on that flight, every stare, every calm reply, every word from Jonas that had felt both revealing and withholding. The notebook, his quiet observation, his refusal to explain who he was. This note was a puzzle piece, but it didn't fit anything yet. From the galley, Camilla's voice called out, "Ava, we're just about done. You good?" Ava stood frozen for a moment, her thoughts spiraling. Then she straightened and called back, "Yeah, be right there." But her mind had already made a decision. She had to find him. He hadn't walked out of her life. Not yet. With a glance at the clock, Ava confirmed she had a few minutes before the crew was expected to leave the aircraft. It was a risk, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. Not until she spoke to Jonas again. She slipped on her blazer, smoothed her uniform, and exited the aircraft into the buzzing terminal beyond. The terminal was alive with sound, rolling luggage, flight announcements, the scattered chatter of travelers. But for Ava, it all blurred into a single murmur. Her focus was singular. She scanned the terminal with hawk-like intensity, her eyes darting across faces, hoping for a glimpse of calm amid the chaos. At first, nothing. Her stomach sank. And then, there he was, standing alone by a long row of windows, his back turned, gazing out at the planes scattered across the tarmac. His briefcase rested neatly at his feet. He didn't look around, didn't seem aware of the people moving past him in a blur. Just like on the plane, he was still, present, yet distant. Ava hesitated a few feet away, her heart pounding. What am I even going to say? The note in her pocket felt impossibly heavy now. She wanted to ask him what he meant. She wanted him to explain everything, the calm, the cryptic phrases, the feeling that he knew her better than she knew herself. But what if he didn't? What if he just left her with more riddles? Finally, she gathered her courage and cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Reed." He turned slowly, unhurried. His expression was just as composed as it had been every moment before. Their eyes met. The sounds of the terminal faded into the background. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, and in that silence, Ava felt more tension than she had during the entire flight. He didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, Jonas Reed seemed as though he had expected this exact moment, as if her arrival wasn't a coincidence, but a natural step in a sequence he'd already envisioned. "Miss Morgan," he said evenly, his voice calm but not cold. Just warm enough to disarm her defenses. Ava hesitated, still clutching the small folded note in her hand. The words she wanted to say tangled in her throat. "I didn't expect to follow you," she admitted. "Or maybe I did." She held out the note. "I found this, in your seat pocket." Jonas's eyes flicked down to the paper. For the first time since she had met him, his expression shifted. Barely, but unmistakably. A flicker of something passed through his gaze. Recognition, and maybe something else. He accepted the note gently, unfolded it, read it, then folded it again. "It was meant to be found," he said quietly, returning it to her hand. "I had a feeling you'd be the one to discover it." Ava furrowed her brow, frustration leaking into her voice. "What does it mean?" "Perception is shaped by what we're afraid to see. What truth am I supposed to be looking for?" Jonas studied her, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You've spent this entire flight searching, haven't you? You felt something was off. You couldn't let it go." "Yes," Ava said, her voice tight. "But I don't even know why. You didn't do anything wrong. And yet, I kept feeling there was something more." Jonas nodded, as if he'd expected her response all along. "Perception," he repeated, echoing the word from the note. "It's a powerful force, one that often has little to do with what's actually in front of us. You saw something in me that didn't match your expectations, and that tension, that uncertainty, unsettled you." Ava's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to judge you. I was just trying to do the right thing, to protect everyone." "And that," Jonas replied, "is exactly why I left the note." Ava looked up, startled. "You didn't judge me out of bias," he continued. "You acted because your conscience told you to, even if it meant being wrong. That matters." There was no mockery in his tone, only understanding. And that, more than anything, unmoored her. "So, who are you?" she asked finally. "Really? Why all the mystery?" Jonas's smile returned, faint, almost wistful. "I'm exactly who I appear to be," he said, "a man traveling for his work, his purpose. But people like me tend to stand out, not for who we are, but for what we represent." Ava blinked. "And what is that?" He paused, then said simply, "Change." The word landed with weight. "Sometimes," Jonas added, "just being present is enough to stir unease. Not because we do anything, but because we exist outside of what others are used to. We become mirrors, and people don't always like what they see in the reflection." Ava stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. "You mean, my reaction wasn't about you. It was about me?" Jonas nodded. "It rarely is about the person we're looking at. It's about what we project onto them, what we fear, what we admire, what we don't understand." She looked down at the note in her hand, her grip tightening. "You sensed something different about me," Jonas said, "and instead of dismissing it, you looked closer. That takes courage. Most people don't bother." They stood in silence. For a moment, Ava didn't know whether to feel enlightened or more confused than ever. His words were soothing and shattering all at once, a strange cocktail of peace and dissonance. Jonas bent slightly, lifting his briefcase. "Keep the note," he said. "You might need it again. Maybe not today, but someday." Before she could ask another question, he turned. His stride was calm, confident, unhurried, the same way he'd walked through every moment of this journey. And just like that, he vanished into the crowd. Ava stood there, frozen. The noise of the terminal returned all at once, rolling luggage, announcements echoing across loudspeakers, the murmur of travelers rushing to and from gates. But she felt completely removed from it all. The note in her hand suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. Perception is shaped by what we're afraid to see. Look closer, and you may find the truth hidden in plain sight. She turned it over, hoping there might be something on the back. A signature, a hint. Anything? Nothing? Just blank paper. Her mind replayed his words over and over. He had given her answers, but they felt like riddles, and each one seemed to birth more questions than it solved. What was she afraid to see? What truth had been hiding in plain sight? And why her? "Hey," a voice cut through her thoughts. She turned. Camila Diaz was walking toward her, weaving through the crowd with quick steps and a frown of half concern, half irritation. "There you are," Camila said, reaching her side. "What are you doing out here?" "The rest of the crew's heading to the lounge. We've got maybe 20 minutes before we board again." Ava slipped the note into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing the paper like it was made of glass. "I just needed a minute." Camila studied her face for a beat, then softened. "This is about him, isn't it?" Ava nodded, unsure how to explain. "He left me something," she said, quietly. Camila arched an eyebrow. "A phone number?" Ava gave a hollow laugh. "No, just a sentence. A truth, maybe. Or a question. I'm not even sure anymore." Camila gave her a look, half annoyed and half amused. "You're starting to sound like him." Ava didn't deny it. She turned her gaze back toward the windows where she'd last seen Jonas, but he was gone. Camila Diaz gave Ava Morgan a skeptical look as she dropped her bag on the lounge bench beside her. "Let me guess. Still obsessing over Mr. Mysterious?" Ava hesitated. Then with a slow nod, she reached into her blazer and pulled out the folded note. Wordlessly, she handed it to Camila. Camila unfolded the paper, her brow furrowing as she read the elegant handwriting aloud. "Perception is often shaped by what we are afraid to see. Look closer, and you may find the truth hidden in plain sight." Camila scoffed. "What is he? A poet? A philosopher? Or just someone who enjoys cryptic nonsense?" "I don't know," Ava replied, her voice soft but firm. But there was something about him. He wasn't just another passenger. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself. It was like he understood more about me than I did. Camila rolled her eyes and handed the note back. Or maybe he's just really good at sounding deep and mysterious. People like that know how to get into your head. Honestly, Ava, you've been on edge this entire flight. Maybe you're just reading too much into it." Ava shook her head slowly. "It wasn't just me. Even the captain mentioned he might be someone with influence. The ground staff wouldn't give a name, just said he was important." "Exactly," Camila said. "Someone with connections, probably wealthy, probably powerful. You know how it works. Different rules for different people." Ava folded the note carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. Her thoughts spun as she tried to make sense of everything. Camila nudged her playfully. "Come on, Let's head to the lounge before we're called to board again. You're spiraling." Reluctantly, Ava followed her through the terminal and into the quiet hum of the crew lounge. It was a stark contrast to the buzz outside, calm, hushed, and low-lit, with the occasional clatter of coffee cups and hushed laughter from a corner. She sank into a cushioned chair, grateful for the stillness. A lukewarm coffee sat in her hands, but she barely sipped it. Instead, her fingers found the note again. She unfolded it, staring at the words she'd already memorized, hoping they might reveal something new. Perception is shaped by what we are afraid to see. Then it hit her. Maybe the note wasn't just about her perception. Maybe it was about everyone else's, too. She thought back to the flight, the murmurs from other passengers, the whispers from the couple behind first class. The woman who'd said, "He looked so polite," as if that alone made him suspicious. The man who muttered, "The quiet ones are always hiding something." Even Camilla, who had commented on how Jonas didn't look like someone who belonged in first class. Every single person had projected their own fears, assumptions, and narratives onto Jonas. Even she had. The calmness, the silence, the briefcase, the writing. It had unsettled her, not because he did anything wrong, but because it didn't match what she expected. It wasn't about who Jonas was. It was about how everyone perceived him, and how much of that perception came from fear. A wave of understanding, mixed with guilt, swept through her. She'd called security on a man because of a feeling, because he didn't fit. And while her intention had been good, protective, she'd never questioned the instinct itself. Until now. Her hand moved to her temple as she muttered under her breath, "Damn it!" Across from her, Camilla looked up from scrolling her phone. "You okay? You've got that look on your face. Like you're about to write a novel or something." Ava managed a small smile. "I think I just learned something today." Camilla raised an eyebrow. "From Mr. Mysterious?" "From myself," Ava said, folding the note and sliding it back into her pocket. "And maybe from him, too." For the first time all day, she felt a sense of peace. Jonas Reed had left her with more questions than answers, but he'd also left her with something far more valuable. The mirror he held up to her instincts, and the permission to examine them. As the hours passed, the weight of the encounter didn't fade. But it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clarifying, as though a fog had lifted and the sharp outlines of who she was and who she was becoming were finally coming into view. The crew lounge hummed with the soft rustle of magazines and the quiet click of shoes. Camilla had fallen into a comfortable silence, munching on a bag of chips, her attention back on her phone. But Ava remained restless. Her mind kept drifting back to Jonas. Not to what he was, but to what he had represented. Discomfort, challenge, reflection. She reached into her pocket again, her fingers brushing the edges of the note. It felt warm now, familiar, and somehow alive with purpose. Why me? She wondered. Why leave it for me? He could have left that note for anyone, a passenger, another flight attendant, even the captain. But he didn't. He left it for her. Maybe it wasn't random. Maybe he'd seen something in her that even she hadn't yet seen in herself. A watcher, a questioner, someone not content to let a strange feeling go unexamined. And maybe that had been the whole point. What kind of work had someone like Jonas Reed been doing, traveling the way he did, quiet yet so disruptive? That question clung to Ava Morgan's thoughts as she stood by the window of the crew lounge, staring out at the organized chaos of the tarmac. Planes taxied in rhythmic patterns, fuel trucks rolled by in practiced loops, and luggage carts zipped between gates like puzzle pieces, clicking into place. Somehow it was all frantic and graceful at the same time, just like the flight she'd stepped off not long ago. Her fingertips brushed the cool glass. It wasn't just Jonas's calm demeanor or cryptic words that haunted her. It was the way he seemed to operate on a different rhythm, not rushed, not rattled, almost as if time moved differently for him. He hadn't flinched when questioned, hadn't protested when escorted off the plane, and when cleared. He simply resumed his seat. No bitterness, no vindication, like he knew it would all unfold exactly as it had. Ava's thoughts drifted back to the notebook. He'd written in it for nearly the entire flight, his hand steady, his attention unwavering. What had he been recording? Observations, thoughts, a report, a story? She hadn't seen the pages, and now she regretted not trying harder to. Whatever he had been writing, it felt like it held the key to understanding not just him, but maybe the entire experience. Camilla Diaz's voice tugged her back to the present. "You're really stuck on him, huh?" Ava turned from the window, her voice thoughtful. "It's not just about him. It's what he made me see. About myself. About how quickly I assumed something was wrong." Camilla lowered her phone and sat forward, her tone softer now. "Ava, you weren't trying to hurt anyone. You thought something might be off, and you acted. That's your job. That's human." Ava nodded. "I know. But the way he handled it, it's like he wasn't even surprised, like he understood it wasn't about him." Camilla tilted her head. "What are you saying? You think he's some kind of mind reader?" "No," Ava said, shaking her head. "I think he's just someone who really sees people. Someone who pays attention, who studies how we react to the unfamiliar, to what we don't expect. And I think he knew that the way I looked at him said more about me than it did about him." Camilla leaned back, chewing on that for a moment. "So what? He's like a walking life lesson." Ava couldn't help but laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe he just wanted me to think that." Camilla shrugged. "Either way, he's got you spinning in circles." Ava looked back out at the tarmac. The sun was beginning to dip, casting soft gold across the concrete and wings of waiting aircraft. "Yeah," she said, "but maybe that was the point." As the minutes ticked by, the crew began preparing to board their next flight. Ava slipped into the rhythm easily, her body moving through the motions she knew so well, checking the passenger list, reviewing the seating chart, adjusting her uniform, but her thoughts remained tethered to that encounter. She kept replaying Jonas's parting words. "You're more perceptive than most." At first she'd taken it as a compliment, but now she saw it differently. Maybe it wasn't just praise. Maybe it was a challenge, an invitation to stay curious, to keep looking deeper, even when it was uncomfortable. She took a deep breath as boarding began. This flight was hers to manage now, and every passenger deserved her full attention. She owed it to them and to herself to be fully present. Still, as she moved through the cabin, helping passengers find their seats and stow bags, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jonas's presence still lingered, like a sentence unfinished, a thought left hanging in the air. Ava stood near the galley as the aircraft taxied onto the runway. She scanned the rows of faces. None of them carried the same quiet command that Jonas had. But for the first time, she didn't just glance at passengers. She looked, really looked, at the man nervously tapping his fingers, at the woman holding a worn paperback, at the child swinging their feet, wide-eyed and restless. And for the first time, she wondered not just what they were doing, but who they were. What stories they carried, what fears, hopes, or histories shaped the way they sat, the way they smiled, the way they avoided eye contact or clutched their armrests. She remembered the words on the note again. Perception is shaped by what we're afraid to see. It struck her differently now. Jonas hadn't left her a mystery. He'd left her a mirror. The real lesson had never been about him. It had been about everyone else and about herself, about the assumptions she made, the biases she didn't know she held, the instincts she trusted without question. The lesson was to look again, to see clearly. As the plane lifted off into the deepening sky, Ava felt a strange, unexpected calm settle over her, a sense of peace, not because she had found all the answers, but because she now knew which questions were worth asking. Would she ever see Jonas again? She doubted it, but he had already left a mark that wouldn't fade. She stood by the galley, the hum of the engines surrounding her like a soft current. Her gaze drifted across the cabin, not searching, but observing, truly seeing. And for the first time in a long while, Ava Morgan felt awake. In the quiet of the cruising altitude, surrounded by passengers immersed in books, movies, and fading conversations, Ava Morgan sat still near the galley, lost not in the cabin's rhythm but in her own thoughts. It wasn't Jonas Reed himself that had left her unsettled. It was what he represented, a mirror. He had reflected something back at her, something uncomfortable and personal. The doubts she tried to suppress, the assumptions she hadn't realized she carried. She had questioned him, doubted him, even reported him to security, all based on a feeling she couldn't articulate. And in the end, it wasn't his actions, but his composure. That unnerving stillness, that deliberate grace, that had forced her to confront something deeper, the way she saw the world, and perhaps even more painfully, the way the world saw her. Her fingers drifted toward the note again, worn at the edges now from hours of being handled and folded and refolded. She opened it one more time, even though she had memorized every word. Perception is often shaped by what we are afraid to see. Look closer, and you may find the truth hidden in plain sight. This time, the words didn't spark confusion. They resonated with clarity. Jonas hadn't left her answers. He had left her an invitation, not to solve a puzzle, but to evolve. The questions she had been asking weren't about him anymore. They were about her. And as the hours passed, those questions didn't feel like traps or riddles. They felt like open doors. She had always prided herself on being observant, picking up on small details others missed. That's what made her good at her job, or so she thought. But Jonas had taught her something else. Observation wasn't enough. Real perception meant understanding. It meant empathy. It meant confronting uncomfortable truths, especially the ones buried inside yourself. Camilla Diaz returned from the forward galley, handing Ava a paper cup of lukewarm tea. "You've been quiet," she said, leaning casually against the counter. "Still thinking about Mr. Mystery?" Ava nodded with a faint smile. "Yeah, but not in the same way I was before." Camilla raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Enlighten me." Ava took a sip of the tea. The warmth spread slowly through her chest, grounding her. "He wasn't just a passenger," she said quietly. "He was a catalyst." "A catalyst?" Camilla echoed, skeptical. He made me question everything, Ava said. My instincts, my assumptions, the way I handle things. I spent the whole flight thinking he was hiding something. But now I think the only thing he was hiding was how much he already knew. Camilla gave a skeptical chuckle. That's deep. A little too deep for a guy who probably just enjoys messing with flight attendants. Ava shook her head, smiling more genuinely now. It wasn't like that. He wasn't trying to confuse me. He was trying to show me something. And he did. Camilla smirked. So what? He's some kind of life coach now. Ava laughed. For real this time. Maybe. Or maybe he's just someone who understands people better than most of us ever will. Camilla took a sip of her own tea, considering that. So what did you figure out, exactly? Ava hesitated, choosing her words. That I don't see people as clearly as I thought I did, she admitted. That sometimes I let fear or instinct cloud my judgment. And maybe I need to be better about that. Camilla tilted her head, her voice softer. We all make assumptions, Ava. That's human. But at least you're thinking about it. Most people wouldn't even bother. Ava nodded, her smile growing. I guess that's what he meant when he said I was perceptive. Not because I noticed something off, but because I kept questioning it, even when it got uncomfortable. Just then, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Ava and Camilla exchanged a look, a quiet understanding passing between them. Their moment of reflection had come to an end. Duty called. Ava moved down the aisle, checking on passengers, offering help, exchanging smiles. But something had shifted. She was looking differently now, not just at what people were doing, but at who they were. The nervous man tapping his foot, the woman clutching a photo album like it held her entire world, the teenager pretending to be distracted by her phone, but whose eyes betrayed a deep unrest. They were no longer just passengers to Ava. They were stories, layers, lives. The plane touched down with a smooth thud, tires kissing the runway. A soft cheer rose from the back rows, a familiar gesture of relief. Ava couldn't help but smile. As they taxied to the gate, she stood by the front, ready to say goodbye to each person. The ones she had passed over earlier, she now noticed. She looked into their faces, not just at them. She didn't know if she'd ever see Jonas again. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe he had already played his part. And her story was just beginning. Passenger after passenger filed off the plane, offering thanks, small smiles, nods of appreciation. And with each one, Ava felt something lift, like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. Camilla nudged her as the final traveler exited. So what's next, Miss Enlightened? She teased. Gonna write a book about your spiritual awakening? Ava laughed, shaking her head. No, but I think I'll keep asking questions. She stepped into the terminal, her steps light, her mind calm, her eyes open. Jonas Reed had been right. Perception wasn't just about seeing. It was about understanding. And for the first time in her life, Ava Morgan felt truly ready to see the world as it really was.